We are 48 hours away from a significant situation that will unfold for millions of people. Everything you will need to know about potential major Hurricane Idalia will be coming up. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Nate, and welcome back to another weather forecast discussion, this time for August 28th, 2023. Now, we have two storms right now, as you guys have known. We've been talking about this for quite a long time now. And so, yeah, let's just get straight into it. We have Hurricane Franklin, which is currently rapidly intensifying right now as we speak. That is actually a Category 4 hurricane with winds in upwards of 145 miles per hour. And then, of course, we have Tropical Storm Idalia, which is actually a 70 mile per hour tropical storm right now, 5 miles per hour away from being a hurricane. And I'm honestly anticipating this to be a hurricane later on today. So don't be surprised if you hear Hurricane Idalia from anyone else, because it more than likely will be. So here's the current satellite imagery. You can see there is Franklin, and you can actually see Franklin has an eye. Usually when you have Category 4 hurricanes, it has an eye by then. You can clearly see the little pinhole eye right there is as clear as day. And meanwhile, we also have Idalia that's over here next to the Yucatan Peninsula. This is going to continue to try and fight off some dry air in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as a little bit of shear. Now, I know you guys don't really like it when we talk about Franklin, because Idalia is obviously the one that's going to impact more people, but there's people that live in Bermuda, and we got to talk about it. Hurricane Franklin, as I said, is a 145 mile per hour Category 4 hurricane. It is anticipated to move near Bermuda by Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, which is the reason why there is a tropical storm watch that has been issued for the island of Bermuda. And it is anticipated to move by as a low-end Category 4 to a high-end Category 3, because it is anticipated to move into a little bit cooler waters. Not much cooler than it is right now, but cooler waters to kind of prevent it from continuing to rapidly intensify. Here is the zoomed in satellite imagery, and boy oh boy does it have that classic buzzsaw look. You can see the clear eye that goes all the way down to the water and how quickly those clouds are rotating around that eye. This is a healthy hurricane, and you can even see that here with our microwave imagery. This is essentially our satellite trying to see where all the main thunderstorm activity is, and you can see this is a well-defined uniform eye wall that is around the eye. The only thing that can really limit this thing at this point is either cooler waters or an eye wall replacement cycle. Of course, eye wall replacement cycles does come with a gradual weakening, but also an expansion of the wind field, which is not exactly the greatest thing for Bermuda, especially if this thing gets larger and larger. So we just gotta hope that this thing ends up just somehow weakening without it being as significant as it is. Fortunately, it is anticipated to move further away from Bermuda, but still something really interesting to note. Now, reconnaissances went through this thing, the Air Force went through, and I mean, it just rapidly intensified right in front of their eyes. I mean, it had a full 5 millibar pressure drop within the span of a full pass, and a pass for the Air Force is about 20 minutes. So for that being as strong as it was, and that big of a pressure differential as it was during rapid intensification, was actually pretty phenomenal for this storm. I mean, this thing is really going on all cylinders, and 100% is rapidly intensifying. So what happens here? How does the storm get steered? Why does it turn off to the right? Why does it miss Bermuda? Well, there is Franklin, as you can see, and there's going to be a trough here. There's a lot of this vorticity that's already starting to develop here in this yellow and orange, but this trough is going to dig through, and it's going to actually kind of swat the storm away from the United States, which means that the East Coast for right now is fine. Maybe not the Southeast for Idalia, but for right now, the majority of the coast is fine from Franklin, and you can see this happen here as we continue to push it on through. There is the trough. You can see the trough extends from portions of eastern Canada down into the Carolinas, and that's the reason why Idalia also comes up too. This entire trough orchestrates this entire thing. It pushes Franklin away from the coast, but it also allows it to go further north until it meets with the trough. It goes further north enough for it to miss this little area of Bermuda, and then it actually puts itself further towards the north and east. And speaking of Idalia here, this is Tropical Storm Idalia. There are hurricane warnings that are now in effect for the majority of the Big Bend all the way down to Tampa Bay. So if you're in those areas, I said yesterday you need to evacuate. I'm saying now you still need to evacuate. This thing is expected to become a major hurricane upon landfall. You can see this black circle with the M that's in the middle, and that is a good indicator there that tells you this thing is going to be a major hurricane upon landfall. Landfall is sometime around Wednesday morning. It could be a little bit earlier, it could be a little bit later, but sometime there Wednesday morning, probably talking about 6 to 7 a.m., give or take quite a few hours, is probably what we are anticipating before this thing weakens to a tropical storm, moves up along the coast, and then back out to Bermuda. So Bermuda might actually get a second shot of a tropical system here well after this thing does the majority of its significant damage over into portions of the southeastern United States. Now here's the satellite imagery. This is going to be really interesting to make a note of because earlier yesterday there was some thunderstorms that were around the center area of low pressure, but it wasn't as significant as this. You can see these very prominent cloud towers that are starting to really pop up, and you can see they are very intense too. A lot of these pink little colors are actually some really cold cloud tops. Essentially what happens is when you go higher up in the sky, it gets colder. And the same premise occurs whenever you have thunderstorms. The higher the clouds are, the colder the tops of them are. And so this is a good way of telling you how intense your thunderstorms are, because the taller the thunderstorms, the more intense they are. And so we have a lot of intense thunderstorms here. It is also starting to expand further out away from the center. Our issue yesterday was there wasn't really as many thunderstorms on the northwestern side. Now it is not only clogged that up, but it is also starting to expand thunderstorm activity outwards to try and create a bit of a barrier for that dry air to try and get into the center. And that's kind of what kills off most tropical systems. It's either the dry air, the colder waters, or the wind shear. It's got a little bit of wind shear displacing its inner core, allowing it to kind of fail multiple times. And it's got a little bit of dry air, a little bit of stable air to kind of prevent those storms from also sustaining a whole lot as well. So once it gets rid of both of them, this thing is primed for rapid intensification, and we're anticipating probably a major hurricane upon landfall. Now let's pull up the radar here from La Bajada, Cuba. This is from Brian McNulty from the University of Miami. You can see that we have a lot of our thunderstorms still on the eastern and southeastern sides. There's a bit of shear that's actually pushing a lot of that thunderstorm activity towards that bottom side. Until that shear gets out of that area, it's going to continue to look like this. But once this thing fully wraps all those thunderstorms all the way around the center, we are anticipating rapid intensification to be likely. But it's still got to get rid of that shear. It's also got a little bit of dry air still, as you can see with the lack of thunderstorms over here on the northwestern side. But it's going to fix those issues sooner rather than later. Now, before we get to the hurricane hunters' reconnaissance and all the data that they got, we got to take a look here at the satellite, because what's interesting here is the hurricane hunters actually found something really interesting that correlated with what the satellite also sees too. And you'll see here, this is Idalia. This is the ASCAT scan. This is the winds towards the surface. You can see a lot of these brown little wind barbs here, which indicate about 35 knot winds here as like a general basis. It's not, it's averaged out. It's not anything that's super specific here. And that's usually the general area where our significant activity has been. It's on that eastern side. But data, and they sent two planes out. They sent the Air Force and they sent NOAA. We're going to take a look at the Air Force because the Air Force focused on this a little bit more specifically than NOAA, although we do have their radars that we'll show you here in a second. But they saw that there was a significant amount of activity on the eastern side, and they went to investigate it. And they found something that was very interesting. Right at flight level, they found a lot of winds that were around hurricane force. Actually, there was a couple that were above hurricane force at 78 miles per hour. And usually when you have winds that strong, that high up, that usually tells you that if those storms were able to wrap around that center area of low pressure, that this thing could very well be a hurricane and this thing could explode quickly, because all of those winds that are aloft are now going to be starting to be forced down towards the ground, so that way it may be able to continue to intensify. And so they found that there. They found that this thing, if it had the opportunity to rapidly intensify, it would, and it probably would be a hurricane at that point. And they also found that the lower level low pressure system, or the lower level circulation, was actually a lot better defined than yesterday. If you guys remember, we were looking at these ovals, and the lower level circulation was kind of on the southeast side of the general circulation. It wasn't very centered. Now that has changed. It seems as if this is a lot more centered, and we also have some hints at hurricane force winds towards the surface. This is the hurricane hunters and all their tracks. They took all sorts of funky tracks here within this. They went from the north down to the south. They cut across. They went from southeast to northwest, and then they actually came across like numerous times towards the middle. They went towards the northwest again, cut across, and then went from southwest to northeast. And everywhere where you see these purples right within here, those are areas where they found hurricane force winds towards the surface. Now, this is the interesting thing. The National Hurricane Center marks storms with sustained winds. They don't rank them based off of their wind gusts. And so whether or not these were wind gusts is the big question. And the National Hurricane Center have kind of determined it to be a little bit of wind gusts. However, they have increased the strength of the tropical storm to be at almost borderline hurricane. So if it were to be sustained, then it probably would be a hurricane, even as we are talking right now. But this is still very interesting as they were looking on through. And they also found, similar to what the satellite said, on the eastern side of the storm was where the majority of the activity was. A lot of significant winds that were on that eastern side of the storm. So now I want to zoom out just to kind of paint the picture as to what this storm is dealing with. We have an upper level low moving in a counterclockwise fashion. And we also have a lot of dry air and a lot of this black. And what this upper level low is doing is it is pushing a lot of that dry air into the storm. So it's getting both shear and dry air. And what the storm is trying to do in response to that is it's trying to expand those thunderstorms outwards to try and prevent that dry air to get in. And if that dry air continues to get in, then it's probably not going to continue to create as many thunderstorms. But as of right now, it seems to be doing a very good job of preventing both. Once you continue to build up more and more, it's going to be pretty hard for you to try and stop the storm from intensifying afterwards. And so we'll take a look at the models here. You can see here's your upper level trough right here as it dips through. And this thing is actually anticipated to move off a bit further towards the north and east. And it is going to provide a little bit of relief for this storm overnight tonight. And usually overnight is when hurricanes actually intensify the most. It's actually the more significant period called D-max. And when D-max actually occurs, similar to what it did last night, thunderstorms can start to become rather explosive. And then, of course, by this time tomorrow, we could be talking about a significant hurricane at that point. But that doesn't mean the wind shear completely moves on. You can see as we get towards Wednesday, there is a new trough that's going to move on through just like this in two areas. And this is going to create a lot of shear, and it's also going to steer this thing up into the Big Bend of Florida. And when it does that, then, of course, we could potentially be talking about a little bit of a weakening, but that probably won't start happening until this starts to make landfall. Once you get that close towards the coast, you have some very favorable sea surface temperatures. I've been talking about how the ocean heat content has been very, very high in some of these areas in a lot of my past videos. We're this close to it to the point to where it's not really that big of a deal to talk about it anymore. It's just the energy in the water is absolutely insane. And the storm really has a lot of things going for it if the dry air and the wind shear doesn't prolong the eventual intensification of the storm. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when this storm actually does make landfall, it is going to continue to move off towards the north and east, and it's going to move along the coastline. And then I mentioned earlier that it was also going to potentially head towards Bermuda, but something that's very interesting here that should be mentioned after this is that it may not be gone for long. You see what happens back over here? This is a ridge that is going to develop over here in the eastern portions of the United States. And this is also another ridge that is developing over here near the Bahamas. And the interesting thing about here is these ridges are going to play chicken. And whichever ridge actually ends up becoming the more significant one is going to steer the storm. And so what's going to happen is as the storm moves along the coastline, it's going to encounter both steering flows and it's going to slow down. And this thing is going to slow down. And then guess what? one of the ridges ends up becoming weak, and it ends up becoming the Bahama Ridge, which means that this high that is centralized over the eastern portions of the United States could potentially try and steer this thing back into the southeastern United States. Watch this here, guys. You can see here on the GFS, that is exactly what happens. It steers it back into Florida and moves it off into the Gulf of Mexico to where it could potentially be a threat towards areas over along the coastal Gulf of Mexico. So that's just a lot of stuff that's a little bit far out. And of course, we're still going to need to watch out for how this continues to interact. Stuff like where two highs start to slow the storm down and it starts to become stationary. That's when stuff starts to get a bit unpredictable, but there is a possibility for it to happen, and I wanted to make sure you guys knew. So let's get into realistic things here. Let's start getting into potential impacts and how they could actually impact people. GFS, the American model, thinks that there could very well be a high-end Category 2 to low-end Category 3, maybe even a mid-end Category 3 hurricane upon landfall at about 953 millibars. This is also anticipated to make landfall sometime after 8 a.m. Eastern, according to the GFS. Now, we're going to go to one of my favorite models. This is the HAFS-A. It's actually a experimental hurricane model, but it is done very, very well with all of its experimental activities. And so we're going to use it. And this is going to give us a general idea as to what's going to happen as this approaches Florida. So you can see sometime here, 3Z Wednesday, that is about 11 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. You can start to see the storm gets close to the coastline of Florida. You can see Tampa Bay starts to get a lot of the wind and some thunderstorms. This is when I think the activity could start to really increase. Once you start to see these bands start to make landfall, storm surge is going to increase. The chance for tornadoes are going to increase. Of course, the flooding is going to increase. And if, depending upon what time this storm actually moves on through, it could actually hit you at high tide. So if you're along the coastline here, you're going to see consecutive storm surge. You're going to see consecutive opportunities for tornadoes to make landfall, just water spouts that make landfall. Flooding is definitely going to be an issue. So anywhere that is to the east of where Idalia makes landfall is going to want to get out. All right. I got to reinforce the narrative here that you guys really got to evacuate. Flooding is going to be a thing. You can see that this is just the regular rainfall in general. All right, and you can see a lot of these yellows and these oranges. This is basically going to be the areas to where there could be aerial flooding. And if you guys have known anything about what's happened down here in the southeast, you guys haven't really had a whole lot of rain in a while, which means that this rain is not going to really be absorbed by the ground, which also means that there very well could be a higher risk of flooding. So just one thing to take a note of, if you are in a flood-prone area, please be sure to get away from it, at least for the duration of this system moving on through. And flood-prone areas include the coastline. If you are along the coastline, I cannot stress to you enough, you need to get out now. We saw what Ian did last year when people were near the coastline, regardless of where it hit. It did damage. And I know a whole lot of people don't exactly live over into this stage of the Big Bend, but 7 to 11 feet of storm surge is pretty intense. And I'm telling you what, right now, I do believe that these numbers are going to go up. I think we could probably get up to about the 15 to 18 feet storm surge if this does turn out to be the worst case scenario. And that is one of those things to where I know you guys have a lot of houses on stilts over there. Those stilts are not going to be tall enough for you guys to survive this storm surge. We're talking water into your second story. That is just not going to be good at all. So please, 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 you have to listen to the local officials. If they issue evacuation orders for your area, it doesn't matter if you live in a mobile home. It doesn't matter if you live in a high-rise apartment. What you guys need to do is you need to get out. You need to get out. You need to make sure that you are in a safe place inland, and that way you may be able to ride out this storm. Because I'm telling you what, right now, if you stay, it's going to get very, very dangerous for you. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll be giving you guys another video tomorrow, more than likely in the afternoon, so that way you guys are able to fully understand as to what exactly you can see. And then, of course, we will be live on this system by the time it makes landfall. So please be sure to join on in, hit that notification bell if you haven't already, and of course, hit the like button down below if you would like to help us spread awareness with this storm. So thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys next time, so peace out, everyone. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel because the next few days are going to be really doozy. Peace out.